afternoon, everyone. It's great to see such a great crowd here today. Welcome and thank you for joining us for the Levin Center at Wayne Law's inaugural event on our campus entitled Congressional Oversight of Classified Programs, Covert Action, Electronic Surveillance, and the Rule of Law. Of course, this is the Center's inaugural event here on campus, but it's not the inaugural event. Actually, there was a very large conference that the Center co-hosted along with the Levin Center on October 20th in Washington, D.C. This was a national conference that we were proud to be a part of, and it was entitled Congressional Oversight of Classified Programs, celebrating 40 years of the Church Committee hearings. So we're very, today is really a continuation of the conversation that occurred in Washington, D.C. on October 20th, and I imagine that Senator Levin will perhaps harken back to some of the comments that were made that day or not. It's your prerogative. But we certainly appreciate the opportunity to have this continuation of that very great conference in D.C. And as all of you know, the Levin Center at Wayne Law was established in March of this year to honor and continue the legacy of Michigan's longest-serving United States Senator, Carl Levin. Its mission is to educate legislators, their staff, public servants, law students, and others on the importance of fact-based, in-depth, bipartisan, and effective techniques in which government can oversee public and private sector activities using oversight as an instrument of change and as a means to increase integrity, transparency, and accountability in our society. I'm also happy that we have with us in the audience 3 or 4 members of our faculty committee that oversees the Levin Center: Professor Carlson, our chair, Professor Milk, Professor Schenk, and also State Representative Jim Townsend, also a student here at the law school. I'm also happy to welcome our great panel today. In addition to Senator Levin, we have Professor Marc Kruman, former State Representative Rashida Tlaib, and as well as Professor Frederic Pearson, and as you know, Wayne Law Professor Roth will moderate today's discussion. Professor Roth holds a joint appointment with the law school as well as the Wayne State Department of Political Science, and he also serves as a member of the Levin Center's faculty board. He specializes in international law, comparative public law, and political legal theory, and was one of the voices that led to this event happening today. So thank you, Professor Roth, and to all of our faculty and students involved in the Levin Center. And with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Roth.
Thank you all for being here. It's really a great honor to be involved with this event, which is connected to the 40th anniversary of the Church Committee report. And the Church Committee was a phenomenon that was really quite important to me growing up. I was 13 years old when this was all going on. And the revelations of the Church Committee, both with respect to surveillance of dissident figures in the United States and with respect to covert activities abroad, including military coups and political assassinations, really had a galvanizing effect on much of dissident activity in this country, and it was the sort of event that led people like me growing up to see a role for ourselves in political participation in this country, and really was a motivating factor in my own political activism as well as my own academic career. So it's really terrific to have an opportunity to revisit these kinds of issues with the kind of panel that we have here today. Of course, the centerpiece of our panel here, the man who needs no introduction but will get one anyway, is Senator Carl Levin. Senator Levin, of course, served the state of Michigan for 6 terms in the United States Senate. He was Michigan's longest-serving U.S. senator. He currently, of course, serves as the chair of Levin Center at Wayne Law and as the law school's distinguished legislator in residence, co-teaching courses on various subjects, including tax law and policy and legislative processes and oversight. He's also senior counsel to the Honigman firm downtown. He played many important roles in the Senate, including as chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and most importantly for today's purposes, chair of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations of the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. in these roles, he held public and private institutions to high standards of accountability, rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse. He was known for carrying out bipartisan, fact-based, and fair inquiries that led to meaningful reforms. And I should say that he has gone on, even to this day, to play a very important role in seeking to extract information that has been kept classified, which is really important to providing for the kind of transparency and accountability that's necessary in a democratic society. And I very much want to applaud Senator Levin both for his actions in the Senate and his continuing actions in this regard to make the important part of the promise of American democracy real. Senator Levin was honored as Time Magazine's, one of Time Magazine's 10 best senators, and this is a substantial part of the reason why. In addition to Senator Levin on this panel, we're joined by Marc Kruman. Marc is the director of the Center for the Study of Citizenship, a longtime chair of the Department of History. He's the author of the books Between Authority and Liberty, State Constitution Making in Revolutionary America, and Parties and Politics in North Carolina, 1836 to 1865. He is a co-editor of a forthcoming book on governance and citizenship, and is writing a book currently on citizenship in Detroit before, during, and after the bankruptcy. And he's going to speak with us today about the impact of the Church Committee on the developments of the time and his reflections of some of the events taking place around that time, including Watergate and Vietnam and the aftermath of those events that gave rise to the impetus for the Church Committee. We're also joined today by Rashida Tlaib. Rashida Tlaib has served 3 terms in the Michigan House of Representatives before being subjected to term limits, unfortunately. And during that time in the House of Representatives, she represented Southwest Detroit, had the distinction of being the first Muslim woman to be elected to the Michigan legislature. And she was a remarkably vocal and passionate advocate for the rights of the underprivileged in this city and this region and in the state as a whole. And anyone who's listened to her speak can understand the sense of passion that she has for the concerns of people who are voiceless in our society. And she's going to be speaking with us today about a topic that requires oversight, and that is this problem of suspicious activity reports, which can be issued about citizens, really for all manner of reasons, where innocent people can be brought to the attention of various agencies in the United States government and subjected potentially to all manner of abuse by virtue of these kinds of essentially false identifications of innocent civilians. Finally, we're joined by Fred Pearson, the director of the Center of Peace and Conflict Studies, a longtime faculty member in the Department of Political Science, recognized authority in the fields of international military intervention, arms transfer, effects on wars, and ethnic conflict analysis. Many books he has written, lists of titles, Civil Wars, Internal Struggles, Global Consequences, co-authored with Marie Olson Lounsbury, Arms and Ethnic Conflict, co-authored with John Sisman, The Global Spread of Arms, Arms and Warfare. You get the idea. And so Professor Pearson is going to talk some about the nature of congressional oversight, and particularly, I imagine, about congressional oversight run amok, which is to say something about the current Benghazi inquiries that are taking place. So without further ado, I yield to Senator Levin.
Well, thank you so much, Brad, for the introduction. Dean, thank you for the fabulous work that you're doing here at the law school. You have a nationwide reputation for the huge momentum which exists not just in the city of Detroit, but at this university, and in your case at this law school. I'd like to introduce, I think he was mentioned before, but Alan Schenk, who's a professor here at the law school, who is teaching a course in tax with me and helping me to understand the tax code. I went after a whole lot of tax avoidance schemes when I was chairman of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, which Brad mentioned, but what I'm also learning now is a whole lot about the technical side of the tax code, and it's essential that he be there with me as I help to teach this course. What Brad mentioned that I'm going to speak on is similar to what we talked about in Washington, which is what Dean Benson made reference to, the forum that we had there, joined by Dick Lugar of the Lugar Center down in Indianapolis, I believe, in Indiana. For those of you who might have caught part of it on some streaming technology, I hope you hear some of the same stories repeated in the same way as I speak here today. The issue that we are talking about today, as it was then in Washington a few weeks ago, I guess, is the question of how do you extract, as Brad worded it, how do you extract information from documents in particular which are classified? How do you find a way to get into those documents when they're important, and particularly when they shouldn't be classified to begin with? The way you can phrase it perhaps more positively is how can we get the legislative and executive branches, and executive in this case usually means the CIA, but it could be the White House. How do you get the two branches to work together to find a way to declassify documents which are classified? Obviously, if they should be classified because the national security requires it, that's one issue. If they should be classified, and there's always a dispute on that. That's kind of a given. The question is that there's a whole lot of documents, probably millions in the archives, but I've dealt with literally thousands of them, which should not be declassified, which should not be classified. And the reasons they're classified are to, for instance, avoid embarrassment to the White House, or to protect the White House policy, which might be undermined if you could declassify a document. So instinctively, White Houses like to protect their documents from oversight, from the view of the public, where they are not helpful to a White House policy, or it may be embarrassing to the White House. I'm going to share with you a couple examples that I've had that involve the Iraq War. Nothing more important than the issue of whether you go to war or not. And when we went to war in Iraq in 2003, a war that I thought was a mistake and voted against, but the point of this discussion that I'm going to share with you isn't that I was right, even though I think I was. The point is that there were some documents there that we tried to get declassified. It could have affected the vote in the Congress or in the United States Senate, and could have impacted public opinion, which we were unable to get declassified at the time when it really mattered, when it really counted. But it could have had an impact on the most critical decision any country can make, which is whether to go to war or not. Now, one of the documents was a document which analyzed the UN inspections that were going on to look for weapons of mass destruction inside of Iraq. The question was whether the UN had completed its inspections or not. Because if it had completed its inspections and could not find weapons of mass destruction, it might have had an impact on public opinion and on the Congress. And so it became very important as to whether or not it had completed it. Now, the White House, of course, said that even though they had completed it, even though the UN inspectors had completed the inspection, that still there were a lot of hidden places where those weapons could be. As it turned out, there were no weapons of mass destruction. But the White House was saying, well, even though the UN inspectors had completed their inspection, that there were thousands of potential hiding places for those weapons of mass destruction. And what I knew from classified documents at the time, subsequently, much too late, declassified, was that, as a matter of fact, we had not even allow the UN inspectors to look at all the possible places, because I believe that if the public saw the UN inspections completed and there was nothing there that they found, that would have been a argument against going to war in Iraq. And so what I had presented in 2 open hearings was I couldn't make the contents of the documents known because they were classified, but I could waive them in front of the audience, in front of the public, and say to the CIA director, you haven't provided to the UN all of the sites which were suspicious sites. And he said, yes, we have. And I said, no, you haven't. Back and forth like that for a boring couple minutes. And this was a hearing either in front of the Intelligence Committee or the Armed Services Committee. I forgot which of 2 hearings came first. And so I said to him, I have the document here which shows you have not done what you say you have done. And so I want to show this to you after this hearing's over. And he said, okay, I'll go back and I'll double check it. So after that hearing, I showed him the document. And he said, I'll go back and check, which he did. And then 2 or 3 days later, when the other committee was holding an open hearing, public hearing, with the same witness, George Tenet of the CIA director, I asked him the same question. Exact same question. Why haven't you delivered all of the suspect sites to the UN? And he said, I've checked, Senator, we have. Now, I couldn't release the document, which would show that he was wrong, because it was still classified. I couldn't say what has subsequently been made public, that it was about, I think, 70% of the sites that have been shared with the UN. But remember, the President Bush, called an end to the UN inspections, told them to get out, told the inspectors to get out, because the war was imminent. Subsequently, there was an investigation by the Intelligence Committee, which was at the time of the investigation was controlled by Republicans. And one of the issues that they looked into was the issue that I raised. It was looking into pre-war intelligence. And so the hearing before the Intelligence Committee and the report went into the question of who was right, Tenet or me. And a Republican-controlled committee said that I was right and Tenet was wrong. Mind you, this was wrong after he had an opportunity to check a classified document. So that's one case where if we could have released a classified document, it would have raised questions as to whether or not we should delay at least going to war until the UN inspections could have been completed. The other example, there's many of them, but the other example, which is still a very much contested example, has to do with whether or not there was a connection between the folks who attacked us, the 9/11 attackers, and Saddam Hussein, who was the dictator of Iraq. Because if Saddam Hussein, the Iraqi dictator, had participated, conspired, contributed to the 9/11 attack, I would have voted to go after Saddam Hussein. But there was no evidence in the classified, for that matter, the unclassified record documents that showed a meeting that the president and vice president said had occurred between a man named Atta, who was one of the 9/11 attackers, and the Iraqi Secret Service, a meeting which allegedly took place in Prague. Now, this was really important. This had to do not with whether there were weapons of mass destruction or not, although that was important. And by the way, I thought there might be weapons of mass destruction also in Iraq. I voted against the war because just because a country has weapons, just because a country has weapons of mass destruction doesn't mean you attack it or else we would have attacked the Soviet Union and vice versa. India and Pakistan would attack each other because they both have nuclear weapons. So I thought he might have nuclear weapons. We voted no anyway, but the big issue for many people in this country was whether or not somehow or other Saddam Hussein had contributed to the 9/11 attack on us. That was a huge issue, and that's where particularly Vice President Cheney over and over and over again said, we have evidence of a meeting that took place in Prague between Saddam Hussein's head of his secret agency and Mohammed Atta, one of the 9/11 attackers. And that was false. The CIA's classified documents were very, very clear that the evidence, there was a report, that the report was totally false. Nobody believed that meeting took place, including in the CIA. So we were fighting to declassify documents that showed there was no such meeting. One of those documents, and I'll end with this, was a cable from our ambassador in Prague to the White House. And that cable said, and now this part of the cable has now been declassified, just part of the cable. That cable said there was no such meeting, even though you had Cheney repeatedly, before and after the war, who kept relying on there was a report of this meeting in Prague between these two people. In fact, the classified particularly was important, the documents, because it was very clear there was no such meeting, even though the vice president was spinning this yarn that there was such a meeting in order to get the American public to get angry enough at Saddam Hussein for somehow or other hitting us or contributing to the attack on us on 9/11. The cable has been, as I said, has been partly declassified, but only partly. And the reason it's been partly declassified is because when this current CIA director came before the Senate a year or so ago, maybe a year and a half or two now, in an effort to get his new legal counsel confirmed by the Senate, I put a hold on that nomination until I could get this cable declassified, which is not only dramatic evidence there was no such meeting, but there's another part of the cable which is highly embarrassing to the Bush White House. I wanted the whole cable released, both the part that emphasized there was no such meeting, as well as the part of the cable which was so embarrassing, and that's the reason, frankly, it's been classified to the Bush White House. Now this is what that cable looked like. See how helpful that cable is. Subsequent to this, I got, again, part of it declassified. The part that remains classified is what I continue to try to get declassified. I'm trying to get members of the press interested who like to use FOIA or other means. That battle goes on because it's an important part of the historical record. And it will really show Dick Cheney for what he was, somebody who misled the American people and helped to mislead us into a war. I said I was going to close with that, and I've taken more than time than I'm supposed to, but if we have time and during the Q&A or whatever comment period we have, I'd be happy to talk about what's called SRES 400, which is a means of the Congress declassifying on its own. It's a very limited mechanism. It's not a very useful mechanism, but it came out of the church committee's investigation 40 years ago. This SRES 400 does provide a path to declassification where the executive branch does not have to concur. It's never been used as far as I know. It's not useful for reasons I can go into, but I've way exceeded my time, and since I'm no longer in the Senate, I can't talk forever.
extraordinary honor to be here today to participate in the inaugural on-campus event of the Levin Center. I want to thank the Senator for bringing such an important program to the university and to the law school, and I want to congratulate Dean Benson for her work in making all of this possible. It's really quite extraordinary, and the goal of the center to dedicate itself to the teaching and implementation of bipartisan oversight is not only to be commended, but to be devoutly wished for. But how do you get there? How do you get to bipartisanship? The Church Committee and the approval of the existence of the Church Committee was virtually unanimous. In December 1974, Seymour Hersh, reporter for the New York Times, exposed what, you'll forgive me saying exposed, what James Schlesinger, briefly CIA director, called the family jewels. A particularly curious choice of terms, getting at those that were issues that were both important and extremely sensitive. The Hersh report created a firestorm politically, but it created a firestorm, I would argue, at least in part, because of when the report was published. Just a few months earlier, Richard Nixon had resigned as President of the United States, kind of culmination of the variety of illegal activities that we commonly refer to as Watergate. A position which, in effect, made it functionally impossible for anyone in the Senate or House to support the president, or soon-to-be resigned and definitely disgraced president. But I think that it was in the light of Watergate that the Hersh report came out, and the response was horror on both sides of the aisle. Impossible to imagine that all of the things that Hersh had exposed could possibly have been true. And I think that if you look at both the near unanimous approval for the Church Committee in the Senate and the Pike Committee in the House, it reflected both a willingness, a new willingness to believe that the government could pose a significant threat to the freedom of American citizens. And all of a sudden, that which was implausible to senators, representatives, and citizens at large now became not just plausible, but very possible. And over some 16 months, the Church Committee exposed an extraordinary array of activities that ranged from heinous to laughable. I won't begin, because time is short, to review them, but it is striking that in the end, Republicans and Democrats came to the conclusion that the executive branch, the CIA, the FBI, the Office of the President, dating back as far as Franklin Roosevelt, had in fact done serious damage to our freedoms. And while the disagreements about the kinds of reforms that should be adopted persisted on partisan lines, it is striking how much agreement a committee that had John Tower and Barry Goldwater on it came to concur with the work of Frank Church. But I also think this all raises a crucial question for us. How do you manage to create a sense of bipartisanship and oversight without the spur of Watergate? Thank you.
Mark, and now we'll hear from Rashida Tlaib.
Well, you're going to tell right away I am not a professor, nor do I, the scope of what we talked about is just phenomenal to me. But I'm going to talk about the impact of war on terror, the quote, war on terrorism right here in our backyard at home. And I'm with the Campaign to Take on Hate, and one of the things that we're focusing on this year, especially because of all the various membership organizations that we have across the country, is the local police department's usage of the federal suspicious activity reporting programs. And you know, it encourages state and local government agencies to collect, maintain, and share these reports, and we truly believe that they do not meet the standards required for sharing criminal intelligence files. Law enforcement collect this information about Americans, and we don't believe they have any reasonable suspicious criminal activity with a lot of the things that they're collecting, and what has been, only a small amount has been released. A lot of you might not know the activity form, which kind of looks like this, is used by local officers, but also local law enforcement agencies, but also by individuals. And it can be all kinds of range of things that are reported. But a number of organizations and partners that we work with, especially the Asian American Justice Center in the Bay Area and San Francisco, and others, especially ACLU, ACLU of California, recently obtained some of the summaries of some of those reports. So here are just a little bit of flavor of what is being reported. By the way, all this information is going to fusion centers. There's about 80 of them in the country, across the country, 80 fusion centers where all this information about us is being provided there. One is U.S. Davis dorm bathroom had, quote, anti-government graffiti written in black marker on the wall. Another one, suspicious upside-down American flag seen on Big Rig. Another is, quote, suspicious gathering at private residence in Elk Grove of individuals what appear to be Muslim faith or Middle Eastern descent. Another is, this is my favorite, quote, suspicious conversation overheard. The neighbor, one of 4 young, clean-cut Middle Eastern males, were speaking excitedly in foreign language. Document that. The other is, I was called out to the above quote address regarding a male who's taken photographs. The male stated that he's an artist and enjoys photographing building and industrial areas because he is a professor at San Diego State Private College and takes photos of his art class. Many of us, the American Action Network in Chicago has filed a FOIA on their local law enforcement, finding out what information is being gathered there. We also are supportive of the lawsuit filed by the Asian American Justice folks in California and trying to obtain more information about it. Only about there's 6 fusion centers in California, and only a few of them have actually released some of the information that they're collecting. As a Muslim American, and this is my personal experience, you know, what I heard from Senator Carl Levin is just wow. And it's like somebody should go to jail for that. It's just my personal. I love how diplomatic he is by saying Dick Cheney misled. I'm like, no, he lied. I know. Sorry, Professor Roth. I was a former student of his. He should be used to me by now. But one of the things that I think really is I think more of a threat even though war is so awful,
is the fact that we're using so much of what's going on, not in here, but just to justify the attack on our civil rights and civil liberties and the slippery slope that it creates. It is scary to hear my fellow Muslims and Arab Americans say they're not doing something because they don't want to look suspicious. It is scary that they are not speaking up and being much more silent because they're afraid of how it looks. To me, that is the essence of it jeopardizes who we are and as a country and as the United States of America. I want you all as young people to also look up Hassan versus City of New York, where New York police surveillance, we finally were able to overturn that. Some of the massive FBI interviews that happened, the massive registration process with a program called NSEERS. So many of these programs, I think, have not truly been open and transparent, and we are fighting a take on hate. We want this information to be public. We want it to be upfront, and right now we are being pushed back and saying, no, it's constitutionally protected, which I think slowly but surely, I do not want to wait 20 years for an apology for folks to say that they did actually impede on our civil liberties and civil rights. But with that, thank you very much.
Thank you. And now, Fred Pearson.
Thank you so much. It is indeed a pleasure to follow, and the points that have been made are tremendously pertinent, particularly on issues of oversight, the Iraq case, and bipartisanship in oversight. It's very important to have Congress functioning as a check on the activities sometimes of the executive branch and doing it responsibly. Unfortunately, what I want to talk about a little bit is some of the lessons of the Benghazi hearings and the Benghazi episode, because in a way it's a case, I think, where some of the potential for turning up important information has been abrogated to a political agenda rather. And for instance, it's my take that rather than 11 hours of testimony of the former Secretary of State who happens to be running for president, it would be also tremendously important for the nation to bring into the hearings the head of the CIA at that time, General Petraeus. Because if we look at what the episode at Benghazi seemed to entail, and some of this comes from an important book called Under Fire, The Untold Story of Benghazi by Burton and Katz, which went into great detail about the actual people trying to protect those compounds that were under siege. They were in many cases contractors, former military, who'd been brought in by both the CIA and the State Department to provide protection. Now there's a great deal of valid questioning that should take place about what went down. It appears that there is reason to think that the CIA involvement in Benghazi was one of the reasons that a deadly delay occurred in the dispatch of those security people from the CIA compound to the State Department compound. A half-hour delay while the CIA people evidently debated with Washington about whether their cover would be blown if they sent these folks in to try to rescue the ambassador, who was clearly under siege. That half hour evidently made a crucial difference in his survival. It appears that, as the Wall Street Journal has articulated, the whole State Department operation in Benghazi was in some sense a cover for what the CIA was doing there for a period of time since 2011. Benghazi, as you know, is the second city of Libya, the home of much of the rebellion against Colonel Gaddafi. And the CIA involvement there had begun quite early and evidently was in very close relationship with some of the rebel organizations. The ambassador's presence there, some have argued, may have had something to do with arms shipments that appear to have gone from Libya eventually to Syria. Now this is debatable. We don't know that this is the case. In fact, it's been denied in some of the hearings when it has been touched. But the shipment of arms to the Syrian rebellion, evidently through Turkish connections, came from Libya, as reported in the London Times. And the whole question of what was Chris Stevens doing there and with what negotiation was he involved with, it turns out, the Turkish consul general who was meeting him the day that he was killed, has not been told very well. has not been told very fully. And I think partly it's the structure of the hearings that the senator has also talked about, which limit the amount of shall we say, classified information or information even mentioning CIA operations in public hearings. And for that reason, not much has been asked or answered. There was one question, I think, by a Mississippi representative to Secretary Clinton about whether the CIA had, or the State Department had, authorized direct or facilitated direct shipments of arms through Turkey to the rebels in Syria. And that was, I think her one-word answer to that was no. And it wasn't followed up. Now, they did plenty of follow-up on whether she was alone that night at her house, and why didn't she talk to the ambassador more, and why wasn't she there to greet the bodies, or whatever it was. Plenty of follow-up to that, but not very much follow-up about the crucial issues of what goes on. And the point I want to make, I think, is that in insurgency operations and situations where two real challenges for intelligence occur, one is the persistence of insurgencies and the other is the ambiguity. It is crucial to know who knows what, when, and how, and for what purpose. And it is also very difficult for intelligence to really make sense of the operations. We know in American history that some cases of intelligence were driven by policy, it appears. I think, for example, of the evident pressure of the Reagan administration on the CIA during the Cold War to up the estimate of Soviet nuclear capabilities, because the estimates being issued evidently did not satisfy the level of threat that the Reagan people wanted to see. And evidently there was pressure on the CIA to do that. We know that the Iran overthrow of the Mossadegh regime was a policy decision, it appears, that used the CIA. On the other hand, the CIA operations, sometimes in motion, as in the Bay of Pigs, dragged the policymakers into mistaken policy that had appeared in the Kennedy administration, following through on an Eisenhower plot to overthrow Castro. So this two-way street of policy and intelligence is crucial to know more about at every turn. And I think we're not being done enough of a service in the intelligence hearings that are public at the moment. Perhaps even in private. I hear that some operations are conducted with consultation of the Big Eight, or the Big Five, as it's called, the congressional leadership of the chairs, but not necessarily the full committees. And again, I think that regardless of partisanship, it's important that the light of day be cast on some of these operations, either before or during or even after they occur, so that the public can learn about the difficult and treacherous nature of intelligence in some of these more murky political situations. We can talk more about that maybe in the Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Fred. Well, we have a lot of time now for question and answer. I'd like to take the prerogative of the chair and ask the first question of Senator Levin. I want here to channel my senior foreign relations law colleague and old friend Mike Lennon, who spoke at your conclave in D.C., and who talked about the standard that was set by the Church Committee for investigations, that they have to ask the right question, that they have to vigorously perform the checking function, that they have to assess administrative and legal responsibility, and they have to recommend practical reforms. And my question is, how are we doing? How is the Senate stacking up, or the Congress as a whole stacking up with respect to that example? Has the example of the Church Committee been fulfilled, or has it been betrayed, do you think, over the last 4 years?
Well, as we just heard, it's clearly been betrayed in the House of Representatives of the Benghazi Committee, which is it's a travesty, put it mildly. And if you don't have bipartisan, in-depth oversight, you're not going to have an impact on policy. You may have an impact on politics, which is obviously the effort of the Republicans in the House, the Benghazi Committee. But you're not going to, and it can backfire, as we can see, when you are so political as they have been. It backfired the last hearing they had with Mrs. Clinton, just worked to her advantage, not to their advantage. But nonetheless, I'd say in the House, it's been terribly partisan. In the Senate, it's a mixed bag. I've been involved in both types. I'd like to think that the ones that I shared with my Republican colleagues, both in the instance of the Armed Services Committee, where our torture report, which involved the role of the Department of Defense in training the people who did the waterboarding, that our hearing was an investigation and report was bipartisan. It was for a very good reason, because I had a Republican who was very strongly supportive of what I was doing, and his name is John McCain. So you had some Republicans who were interested in going after the torture which took place in a number of places. Same thing on Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. In that case, that particular subcommittee has rules which protect the minority. Unlike the House of Representatives, where the minority really have no rights. There are already rules in the House of Representatives, period, and that's the end of the subject, the end of the story. In the Senate, the minority has rights, and it's very important to the functioning of the Senate that if it's going to accomplish anything, you have to work with the minority. You can't do what they do in the House, which is just run roughshod over the minority, whoever the majority is. So in the Senate, not only do the rules of the Senate protect the minority and therefore require bipartisanship if you're going to get anything done, because you need 60 votes because of the filibuster rule, but in the subcommittee that I chaired, this Permanent Subcommittee on Investigation, which has very, very broad powers, it's the only committee or subcommittee in the Senate which can look at anything, not just subjects which are within the jurisdiction of a particular committee like banking or armed services or whatever. But that one subcommittee, that permanent subcommittee, can look at any subject, and we have. So we looked at the financial collapse, we looked at torture issues, we looked at a number of things. And there I had, again, two ranking members, two Republicans, more than that, who were willing to work with me. And that involved McCain again, it involved Coburn, very, very conservative senator who was willing to look at certain issues on a combined basis. Bill Cohn from Maine, Republican, I worked very closely with him. So a lot depends on the personalities, but in the Senate, again, there are certain institutional reasons for bipartisanship. They don't always work. If you look at the Intelligence Committee report on torture, for instance, it is a highly partisan report. The redaction problem, though, the inability of that committee to have a less redacted or a more open report was not the problem of the Republicans. When the Democrats were in control, when we were in control, we couldn't get the Obama White House to cooperate with us on declassification of the torture report. It took a couple years and we didn't get very far. And that was a Democratic administration protecting its own, whatever they thought they were protecting, against the drive of a Democratic Senate committee to declassify more of a torture report. So it's kind of a mixed bag in the Senate.
Well, let's have questions from the audience. Yes, Paul.
Buying box cutters is on its face not illegal, and taking flying lessons is not on its face illegal, but when you put them together, it can have lethal consequences for some 3,000 people, as it did on September 11th. So is the problem the collection of the information? Is the problem the failure to publicize the information or reveal the information? Is it the failure to connect the dots when the dots ought to be connected? Is it the failure to expunge the information and declassify when the dots cannot be connected? There's a lot of information out there. What are we supposed to do with it?
Well, it seems to me that in many respects, and good intelligence work is similar to good police work. And connecting the dots really is a key factor because information does flow in and is not properly digested or is misperceived and so on and so forth. There were warnings before Pearl Harbor which were misconstrued. In many cases you get information that's misperceived through processes of bureaucratic politics or what we call cognitive dissonance for the psychologists, doesn't fit the rubric. And in many respects it also has to do with not searching enough, I think, for potential unintended consequences of what happens. The whole presence of the United States in the Middle East, for instance, has been generated at times without much forethought about the long-term implications. For instance, of having permanent bases on the Arabian Peninsula. For instance, about having permanent bases in the Persian Gulf on Bahrain. What that does to American policy and what that does to the perception of the United States in the region and the backlash that it causes was considered, I think, to a certain degree incidental in some of the intelligence analysis and the political analyses. Not gauging the depth of anger and bitterness that these things generate, I think is a cultural misperception. And often that little flavor of cultural awareness is what's lacking in the interpretation of intelligence material, which is so crucial.
But I think the answer to your question could be any of those. Examples of all of those problems. The one you mentioned, the box cutters and the flying lessons, which goes to the 9/11 incident, there was important information in the hands of the, I guess it was the hands of the immigration folks. It was not shared with, it may have been the CIA, it was not shared with the FBI. They were actually in a room prior to the attack, people from two agencies where they had information on, I think, 2 or 3 of the hijackers, highly suspicious information, which was not shared with the FBI because it couldn't be. And I think it was the CIA failure in that case. It was a stovepiping issue. It was, we're not allowed to share this information with you. But that literally took place with the 9/11 attackers, where there very specifically was critical information in the possession of one of our agencies, I believe, if my memory's right, the CIA, that was not shared with an agency which could have followed it up and perhaps prevented 9/11.
Yes, hello. 2 questions. One, why are Dick Cheney and George Bush not incarcerated? And number 2, if a citizen is concerned about what either the federal government is doing or what the state governments may be doing in connection with the federal government in terms of surveillance of people, groups of people, movements of people, people who organize, such as Occupy movement comes to mind. What do you think the role of a U.S. Senator or U.S. Representative is in terms of representing their constituent and helping them find out this information?
You're looking at me, so I guess that's... I would say, to answer your second question, there's a number of things you have to do. One possibility, however, is that you discuss with your U.S. attorney, your district, which you surely did, and I think Barbara Quaid has done a terrific job in connecting with the Arab American and Muslim American community. There's others here that can give a better assessment than I can do it from my perspective, and I help to pull together those meetings between U.S. attorney and communities that are impacted by discriminatory treatment. That's one of the things you can do. You want to get these good people in the government who are willing, who have power, in the case of the U.S. attorney, with the FBI, for instance, or with Treasury or whoever, to work with those agencies. In terms of why people aren't in jail, I think prison, I think prison is, you'd have to check with the Justice Department as to whether or not the laws were, there's enough evidence that you could convict someone beyond a reasonable doubt of violations of specific criminal laws. I can't comment on that. More than that, I think, by the way, that use a harsher word, that I do believe that Dick Cheney lied us into war. He told lies, I believe. But on the other hand, Congress also had a responsibility. Congress, by overwhelming majority, voted. Every one of us had access to classified information and reached a different conclusion. We have to have elected officials who are willing to do the digging into classified information. It is available and accessible to us, and then take unpopular positions. You remember the Iraq War was popular. Shouldn't have been, but it was. It was popular if you look at the public opinion polls at the time, not now. So you needed people who were dubious about the wisdom of that war, who were in office, to take what was then unpopular positions, which is to vote no on what was then a popular position. That's very important. That has to do with how courageous are the people that you send to office, and whether you're willing to understand that there are times when they're going to not follow public opinion and should not follow public opinion.
Further thoughts on that? Senator?
Senator, I think most of us would agree that that it's important to classify certain sensitive information related
You need to speak up a little more.
I think this is not on.
City work.
Reggie's a very soft-spoken person.
I think most of us would
Very
agree.
big stick, though, I'll tell you.
You're very kind, Senator. It's an honor to be here with this
He's on
panel.
our panel, too, at the Levin Center, too, which we very much treasure his presence.
It's very kind. It's a pleasure to be here. Most of us would agree that certain sensitive intelligence information should be classified in order to preserve national security. How do you feel we're doing from a legal framework, in our legal framework, in terms of drawing the line as to where that is? And how do you strike the balance with Congress? You mentioned Senate Resolution 4, and if you could talk a little bit more about that in terms of any ability of Congress to push back so that before we get into a situation as we did in Iraq.
Well, the resolution which exists is not very helpful. It's available, it's a theoretical resolution which basically says that, and at least as far as the Senate is concerned, which I'm familiar, that if the committee, the Intelligence Committee in the Senate wants to declassify something, it has to notify the President. The President has like 5 days to decide, which is way too short. Has to personally decide, which is okay, but you got to give them long enough to do it. Then notifies, as I remember, notifies the Senate, and then either the majority leader and the minority leader together can trigger a classified meeting of the Senate behind closed doors, or the majority of the committee, Intelligence Committee, can trigger a meeting behind closed doors, and then there's a vote. There's a lot of problems with that mechanism. We ought to, for instance, allow either the majority or the minority leader to trigger such a meeting. It shouldn't require both, because that means one can protect the president. If they're the same party as the president, they may want to protect the president. It also gives the majority of the committee the power to trigger that meeting, which is a critical issue as to whether there's going to be a debate in the Senate and then a vote. The other problem is that there's a majority vote in the Senate, which means that you're denying, with a very tight time limit, the rights of the minority to do something in the Senate, which they otherwise are protected in. So it could be changed, and should be changed, in my view, in a number of ways, but it has never been used, and even though I don't know that my listing of some of the parts of its process are the reasons for its never being used, nonetheless the fact that it's never been used is pretty clear evidence that it's not practical. It's not a practical way to declassify material. So we should modify that resolution because it could be made practical. I think we ought to have a right in the Senate or the House. You know, we ought to have a right to declassify information. That shouldn't be a unilateral decision on the part of the executive branch, providing there's protection for the executive branch. Reasonable period of time, maybe even a veto of the president, possibly, that could be overridden by the Congress. So there's ways of, in a balance of powers and checks and balances, that you can give power to both Congress and the president in a fair way, and give the other body an opportunity, in the case of the Congress, to override, for instance, a veto. But that's not the subtlety with which this SRES 400 approach has been written.
Next question? Yes, ma'am.
Hi. So a lot has been said today about information, about freedom, about surveillance, but not a whole lot has been said about people like Snowden or James Manning. I think it was just recently, former Secretary of State Clinton suggested that Edward Snowden in particular could have gone through the proper channels. I think they should release the information that he did, which is very important information for American people to know, and yet it seems from what some of the panelists are saying that it's not clear that going through the proper channels necessarily would have resulted in much. If the ultimate goal is to make sure that the American people are aware of these kinds of programs, surveillance, and so forth, making sure that bad decisions aren't being made, I wonder what the panelists might have to say about that situation in particular, or more general.
I'll take a stab at that, and I'll try to figure out what my thoughts are. I'll take a stab at it if no one else wants to. Or I think others are probably tempted to. I hope after what I say it may trigger some reaction. You can't leave it up to each individual citizen to decide whether they're going to declassify something. Whether you love what that person does or hate that person. Or else you don't have the protection which we've got to have for some classified information, where you're protecting sources and methods, for instance. That is a legitimate reason to declassify, or else we're never going to get secret information. If we can't protect the source, and we jeopardize that source because it's public, you're then going to dry up important information. So there is a legitimate reason to classify it. It's the overclassification which is the problem. Now that was important information, obviously, which Snowden released. He's got to be willing, in that case, I believe, to take the consequences. I very much admire people who do things which violate law for principle. I mean, yeah, love what Martin Luther King did, or Gandhi did, or others did, or Mandela did, all illegal, willing to take the consequences, take their case to court. But a jury convicts Snowden, I'm not so sure that he could get 1 out of 12 who could say, hey, it was worth it. What he did was worth it. I'm not convicting him. Juries tend to not be too legalistic. They tend to, I shouldn't maybe say this in this setting, but juries tend to try to do what makes the most sense somehow, or it feels right, despite all kinds of instructions from judges and so forth. And so maybe Snowden could have had one juror who would say, I'm not convicting that man because what he did was worth doing. Okay, so I think you got to be willing to take the consequences, basically, and not run. If you're going to hit, which he did, and run, I don't have much respect for you at all.
There is a follow-up, of course, to that too, and that is recalling, let's say, the Pentagon Papers incidents and the importance of that document. Evidently, that did get out. And the repercussions of trying to shut up the guy who put it out later on. So there are whistleblowing urgencies sometimes that people feel,
willing to take it?
And willing to take the consequences. Although I'm not sure having your psychiatrist's office ransacked should be one of the consequences.
I think that Snowden has indicated that he would come back to the U.S. if he received a guarantee that he was not tortured. So that.
Well, I think that's better. I think if he came back to the United States, it would be so visible, there's no way that he's going to be tortured. I can't imagine. He has a real fear of being tortured here.
Mark, did you want to have any historical
No,
perspectives?
I was going to remark about the Pentagon Papers themselves and the consequences they have on public policy. But I think that the answer is, in the end, I would agree with the senator that is coming back. If I were a juror, knowing what I know, I wouldn't vote to convict, which is why I wouldn't be on the jury. But I think that in the end, accepting the consequences of your action. On the other hand, it also reflects the ways in which the exposure, which is embodied in oversight, has changed things in ways that had been simply accepted until they became public knowledge.
The degree to which sometimes excesses can occur in the defense of sensitive information is to be noted because, for instance, the Iran-Contra incident, as ludicrous as it was, evidently was contrived to try to get the American CIA station chief out of Beirut. And, it was an all-singing, all-dancing catastrophe that was designed by a Marine colonel and involved Central America. And two illegal operations, one against Contras, and one for Contras, I should say, and one arming Iran. So if there's ever an incident where Congress, needs to get involved and whistles need to be blown, it's that kind of thing. And Benghazi, by the way, has, questions have been asked about whether any element of it bears resemblance to that in the terms of the arms shipments, and it's something that we should investigate.
Well, we're into the next class session here, but I think we should take one more question that was still outstanding, and then people, I'm sure, will have some opportunity to speak with the panelists afterwards. But yes.
Ms. Tlaib, what is the use or uses that are being made of some of this bogus information? How is it impacting, in a real-time sense, those about whom they're being reported?
Yeah, we're not actually sure what the usage of the information at the fusion centers, how long are they kept. I think at our last conference and gathering of the various membership organizations, predominantly Arab American Human Service agencies that are very troubled by this collection of information, is that, at this time the activity may not be illegal so far, but we don't believe it's reasonable, suspicious criminal activity. And that this information is gathered, how is that going to be used later in regards to, whatever activity comes forward? I don't know. I mean, one of the things that somebody said to me was, activity that Mandela did was considered terrorism, right? And later on, obviously, he was, this phenomenal leader. He wasn't a terrorist anymore, right? He was a freedom fighter, or whatever you want to label him. But at the time, that activity was not technically labeled that way. But the information, for us, it's the act of what I would, to talk about Professor Pearson and saying, I think he was referencing sloppy police work. I mean, this is like local law enforcement collecting kind of this information, and what that information do. It's kind of a waste of time in some essence, when sometimes it does just result with the information is there, but they're not sharing that information that prevents the actual terrorist act, right? I mean, this is information that in some ways, if you balance it, it impacts civil liberties and civil rights more than it actually protects us. It actually jeopardizes our core American values, versus the actual information intelligence that is being provided that could have stopped 9/11, but somebody didn't have that conversation and that information sharing in that sense. But for us, it's the collection of information, how is it being used, and later on, is that going to be used somehow towards this person's, whatever, freedom, they may be detained, and so forth. So it's for us, and it's our quality of life. Like, it's going to prevent many members of the Muslim and Arab American community from freedom of, from expressing themselves, speech-wise, being anti-Iraq war, being, it's like we're seen as less patriotic. I mean, somebody's like, if I mow my lawn 5 times a day, are they going to, put a SARS report on me? I mean, what is it, watching every little thing about what we're doing and reporting that out, to many of us jeopardizes our freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of speech. So that's what we are really tremendous for. And we said, if you're going to collect this information, just be transparent. Provide us the information. What are you collecting? Most of the reports that we got through the ACLU just doesn't mention names, but mention those various activities. And that to us opens eyes, like what is being monitored, what is being reported out.
Well, I want to thank all of our panelists, but especially Senator Levin for giving us this.
Thank you all for joining us. Great.